Welcome to the preparation session for fellows and sponsors for the Academy. I'm very, very glad that we have this session today, and I want to thank Claire Holland, who is our Academy member engagement person, and also Carolyn Kane, the Chief Advancement Officer for the Academy, and helping to set this up. I'd also like to thank Drs. Gross, Simpson, Amar, and Bowers for being willing to share their viewpoints with you today. Each of these individuals have either been on the selection committee or had many successful applications that they have shepherded as sponsors. So we're very fortunate to have them today. I was the co-chair for the 2020 selection committee and actually will be the chair next year. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how the fellow selection committee is composed. It's one of the standing committees of the Academy, and each year there are 4 new members elected and then 2 members appointed by the Academy board. The number of applicants are then divided up into dyads. Currently we have 8 dyads. Each of those dyads is comprised usually of a new member and a member that has had at least 1 year on the Academy. And then there's also the chair, the co-chair, and our advisor. Dr. Ann Gross was our advisor this past year, and Dr. David Kapnew will be the advisor for next year. These positions are appointed by the Academy board. On the dyad, what happens is the Academy sends out to us, a conflict of interest statement for us to sign, saying that we will hold the business of the selection committee confidential, and also then they will send us out all of the individuals of the applications. We review those applications to see if there's any conflict, and if somebody says there's a conflict, then that person isn't appointed to their dyad. This last year, we had 370 applications. So each of the 8 dyads reviewed approximately 45, 46 applications. And then the chair and co-chair, we reviewed independently each one of those applications. Once the dyads have finished their independent review, then the 2 members have a conversation about their scores, either to accept or they don't feel like the candidate meets the qualifications, or they're not sure, that it's a maybe. So then the co-chairs also independently look at all of the members, and we discuss our scores. Any of the differences in the scores for those 370 individuals, those are discussed by the full committee. And what happens is the Academy has sent us all of the applications in a Dropbox so we can all review each one of those applications as we discuss them. And then we, as a group, we again vote to see if that person is accepted or they're not meeting the application qualifications for the committee. This last year, out of the 370 applicants, 230 were recommended and accepted for the Academy, which is about 62%, which is, even though we had more applications this last year, the previous year we'd had 312, and the 5 years prior to that, it had been in the 200s. So even though we had more applicants, the percentage of acceptance was about the same. Now, each one of the members that are on the webinar today are going to talk about specific aspects of the application and the sponsorship project. At the same time, at the end of our session, there is going to be a question and answer session, so you can send those questions in, and Dr. Gross will be facilitating that session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just so happy to see so many people here today for this discussion. I'm going to talk a bit about the application process and then turn it over to my colleagues who will share some lessons learned from their experiences and involvement as sponsors, fellow selection committee members, and applicants themselves. I want to start just by saying this process takes time. If you are an applicant, it takes time. And why does it take time? I think it takes time because it's hard for most of us to write about our accomplishments. And it usually requires a few writes and rewrites to get the full extent of your contributions and impact documented. So it's just a word of advice to get started early in the process if you are considering applying. Over the years, as Jane said, I have been involved with the Fellow Selection Committee for 6 years. It's been an immense privilege, and I've read many hundreds of applications. And as I've thought about what makes a really strong application, 3 things come to mind. First, the applicant narrative, that part that you as the applicant write your story in your own words, that narrative sings in a great application. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's clear that the applicant is confident and proud of their work. They're able to express what they've done in specific terms that illustrate the impact of their work on other nurses, on the community, on policy formation, or on society as a whole, and that they're clearly contributing to the advancement of our profession and the health of our world. Secondly, that narrative is backed up with further detail from the CV. So in other words, the 2 documents work together to really paint the picture of what the accomplishments are and the evidence to support those accomplishments of each applicant. A word of caution here that there are word limits to each one of these, each narrative question and to the CV, and you must pay close attention to that because you can be disqualified for exceeding a word limit, because the Academy and the Fellow Selection Committee is so committed to maintaining a very level playing field for everyone. No one has the advantage of more words than the next person or anything like that. So thirdly, what makes a really strong application is that the sponsor statements also sing. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that by reading them, you can see that those sponsors know the applicant, they have a deep understanding of their work and the impact that it's had, and they're really convinced that this applicant is ready for induction. So as the applicant, you need to be really clear in thinking through who are you going to ask to sponsor you, because you also want your sponsor statements to emphasize different parts of your career and your contributions. You don't want them to be redundant statements. And I guess the other thing I would say as you're thinking about your application is that the Fellow Selection Committee that reviews your application only has your application to go by. They cannot Google you. They cannot read your papers. They can't look you up in any way. If they know you, they must recuse themselves or refrain from offering any additional information about you that isn't contained in your application. So you really need to have the time to put this, paint this picture through these, your CV, the way your CV amplifies your narrative, and how you choose your sponsors. So just before I hand it off to Dr. Simpson, I just want to say a couple summary suggestions. Go to the Academy website and read all the material that's there on the fellow application process and selection process. I didn't go through each step and each requirement because we really want to save some time for dialogue here, but there's a ton of really helpful information there. There is a pre-application self-assessment that's really helpful to get you organized and help you gauge your readiness for applying. And then I also would say just think really hard about who your two sponsors can be. They must be members of the Academy in good standing, and make sure that you invite them in plenty of time for them to be able to develop their statement for you and to work together with the other sponsor and with you to really make that application sing, as I like to say. So thank you all. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Roy Simpson, who's going to talk about sponsorship, and then we'll come back, as Jane said at the end, to entertain any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gross, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Always exciting to be a part of the Academy. And I think one of the reasons that people like to be a part of the Academy is the branding. As once you have your Academy initials after your name, it's like a golden handshake, because even when you're not in the area of your specialization and someone knows you're in the Academy, they know you have contributed drastically to the profession and the advancement of patient care. And I think that's really important, because that does carry a lot of brand with it. And I think that the collegiality is a lifelong collegiality in the Academy. There are other organizations you belong to because of your work, but you belong to the Academy for a lifelong endeavor. So I have had the fortunate pleasure of putting in probably about 40-something people into the Academy over my 30 years in the Academy. But one of the things that I have learned is that when either I'm seeking out someone to sponsor or someone asks me to sponsor them, I am very quick to say, let me see your resume before I say yes or no. Because a lot of times, especially if you're like me and you were a service person before you became academic when you retired, you don't keep up with all those details that people are good about in academics. So I always make sure that the resume is robust and fulfilling. The other thing that I try to do is I try to not get tied up on degrees, but contribution. And the reason is that people have different journeys in which they gain their educational competencies, and the degree that they have may not align to what their contribution was. For instance, they've been a state representative, but their PhD is in research. So, you know, there are a lot of things like that. So I try to look at how they're going to go. And the other thing is I don't sponsor somebody that I don't know. I just have learned that being blindly asked to sponsor someone, if I don't know them, I don't tend to encourage them. I tend to seek and help them find somebody that is within the organization. The other thing is I make sure that whoever the co-sponsor is with me, that we have a thematic approach. I write on one part of them, somebody else writes on another part, and they write on themselves. It used to be long ago, people talked about that you had to have somebody from academia and somebody from service and somebody from research. And some, you don't, that does not really tie in for truism. What ties in for truism is you need people with different lens to look at what you're writing so that you can be exemplified in the best light. And that's what you're looking for, are writers who can exemplify your contribution. And I think that's really clear. And I am going to say this, and I'm sure I'll get a million things and people tell me I'm crazy, but one of the reasons that researchers get in quicker than service people is they have a clear focus to their contribution from the day they finish school. I mean, if they are doing nothing but big data research and they've done big data research for 30 years, that's all, that's their focus. And so one of the things that is hard for a lot of people is to narrow it down your window for what all of your career has been as you approach it. Now, if you're 25 years old and you're applying for the Academy because you just got elected to the US Congress, that's a whole different subject. But the reality of it is you need to have a sense of what your contribution over time is. And the other thing that I always tell people that I think is really important is that they need to be aware you have to have published. Now, in today's world, there's a different ways of publishing than in prior worlds. Not everything is NIH publishable, but you have to contribute to the media outlet for people to know what it is you do. And social media is one of those things. And that's a new trend within our profession. And so we have to look at other types of activities. The other thing that I think is really important is that you have to make your choice of words really, really clear, folks. And let me give you a perfect example. I was on the committee one time, and I don't want to be on the committee again because, man, that's a lot of work. It's way too much work. But I was on the committee, and this person said, I am the first person to do this in their application. And lo and behold, the person on the committee actually said the same thing about herself when she got in. And the person said, oh no. So choose your words carefully, like pioneering. You never, unless you are so familiar with the literature and everybody out there, then you could say first. But be very cautious with the words you use and let the words be clear. I think Ann Gross mentioned that, the clarity of the world. And the other thing that I wrote about was, I think it's a marketing exercise about yourself rather than a scholarly document. And I think that gets a lot of people, I think that's where I've been beneficial in being able to get people in, because I'm not a scholarly writer. As Harriet Worley told me back in the 80s, you're a folksy writer, Roy, but people will understand what you say. And I think that's really important when you're writing, because you've got to convey in a short number of words exactly what it is you do and what you contributed to people that are not in that specialty. That really caused things to happen from that standpoint. And then the other one that I wanted to be sure and tell people was, sometimes you get a resume and you just hold it up and you're like, wow, why are you not already in the resume? And that's a fault of Academy members. We need to make sure there aren't people out there that we should have sponsored and reached out to and encouraged to make application. And then last but not least, when you're in a service role, it's hard sometimes to articulate group dynamics. But I need to say this, you need to be a little bit egocentric. Now, I realize some of us have a feeling that we should be sainted while we're alive. I understand that, but the majority of people really have a hard time writing about themselves in a very egocentric way. And you just got to get over that. You just have to bite the bullet and say, this is what I did, and move on with it. And I think those are my salient points. I think it's a wonderful organization. I've never missed a meeting. I just think it's great to be able to get to connect with everybody and know that you will connect to them over a lifetime. And I think that Mary Woody was my next door neighbor and a longtime friend of mine. And Mary said, every time I would come home from the Academy meeting and she was in her later stages of failing health, she always wanted me to come by and tell her what all went on at the Academy, because she really enjoyed keeping up with everybody that contributed to the profession. And the Academy people do contribute. It's a great organization, and I hope you'll sponsor as many as you can to get people in. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Amar.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you to everyone for having me here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I support candidates, or things that I think can be helpful in supporting candidates to be successful in their application. And I'm going to talk about three things: how to help with the contribution, how to think about evidence, and then some pitfalls that I think people encounter. So the biggest thing with the contribution is really thinking about the impact of the work and the significance of the work. And when we think about impact, it doesn't necessarily mean what you did, it means what difference did it make? How did it change things? How did it make things better for people? So the scope of influence then typically is at some broader level, that it isn't just the local in your community. It's more about the regional, state level, national level, international level. But how did this work that you do made a difference? And that people can see that it was a sustained contribution. So it wasn't a one-hit, one and done, but that there was some sustained contribution in leadership. And obviously, if you can translate that into policy, the main objective of the Academy is really about policy. That's very helpful. When we think about the evidence, those are all the things that you've done that show, yes, this made a difference. Yes, I have an impact. So publications, Roy mentioned that they were cited, translated, replicated. People are using your work. External funding, sustained funding, external funding, large amounts of funding. Your things were adopted. So if your practice guidelines cite your work, if National Academy of Medicine documents cite your work, use your work, education guidelines use your work, that shows that that work has meaning. That's great evidence. Any policies, legislation that's happened as a result of your work, testimony in Congress shows that. Substantive honors, big awards, commendations, government kinds of recognition. Recognition of expertise through invited speaking on topics, invited to review grants for the Canadian Institutes of Health on your specific area or South African group, shows that you've got expertise. Also, thinking about your work on other review panels, international board participation, being invited to represent nursing on is this better? I just went in and out. Fading in and out. I wonder if I'm better off. Maybe I sit for, is this better? Okay, sorry. I don't know what happened with this. So I was saying evidence, like your publications, review panel, study section, big awards, leadership in professional organizations, big honors, commendations, awards. And then the pitfalls is the last piece. And I really like to think about that as being something that's bigger than the job responsibility. So we all have things that we have to do as part of our jobs. We publish, we make outcomes. And so thinking about it at a place that's bigger than just what you do for your job. Group work is another area that can be problematic because in group work, it's hard to claim it solely as you were the driver of it. So unless you're like the only nurse on a panel of other people, which makes it kind of clean, group efforts are really hard to tie in and make this work. Single site, local focus can be problematic. A lack of innovation, lack of significance to what you're doing can be problematic. I think one of my colleagues already said not following directions. And then one of the things I see commonly is that people like to write a sort of like a resume of accomplishments more than talking about impact and what it meant. And so being careful that you aren't just saying, I did this, I did this, I did this. You really can say, I did this, and these things resulted from it, and you can see my impact. So I apologize for the problem with my headphones, but I am going to turn it over to Dr. Bauer. Thanks.
There we go. I am thrilled to be here as well, and I don't have Roy's 40 plus applications to acknowledge, but I have probably nominated in the area of 15. And I would have to say some have been successful, most have been successful, some are not successful. So I always try and know that that's a possibility. So I have about 6 things that I want to go over with you. One is, if I'm thinking with my sponsor hat on, number 1 is be thoughtful about saying yes. Be considered when saying yes. It's an investment of ego. It's an investment of time, money, energy. So make sure this is an investment you're willing to make, and ultimately discuss this investment with the applicant as well, because they've got to make it. Your role as a sponsor is to put forward only those applicants that you think have a possibility of making it, that you believe that this person has reached the level where they will probably be accepted as an Academy member. If you don't think the person's ready, have that discussion. Talk about why you don't think the person is ready. Talk about what the strengths are. But if you need to, listen to what the back part is. And if you still feel it, talk to the person about what you think will take to make the person more successful. I learned this because a number of years ago, I supported two people that I wasn't sure of. And I will tell you, neither one of them were accepted. So I really look at that. So people have already said this. I want to emphasize it. You have to know the person that you're sponsoring. The only way I can write an application sponsor letter is if I know the person's work. Otherwise, it becomes more copy and paste. It's not generic. It's too generic. It's not genuine. So I too look at the CV. I sometimes interview the candidate. And if so, we move forward. But I do want to have every potential sponsor in this conference know it is okay to say no, and that sometimes saying no is the right answer. So just be thinking about that. The second thing is consider your co-sponsor. Somebody else has already mentioned the co-sponsor, but who is it going to be? Can you work with that person? Can you have a discussion between the co-sponsor, you, and the applicant at the beginning and talk about how you're going to allocate things, how you're going to move things forward? And I have to say, the other big piece for me is the application is best done when it is a close collaboration between the sponsors and the applicant. It does no one any good to have the sponsors presented with a completed application and there you go. So work well together. My third point is to focus on the focus. Now, what I'm telling you is not earth-shattering. It's not. You're not going to go, wow. But it's things that I've learned over time. Number one, read the application as a sponsor. If you haven't sponsored somebody recently, read that application because it guides everything. I agree with Angela that the next thing you do is say, what are these persons' contributions? Are they significant? What's the evidence? What are the outcomes or the impact? What's the dissemination? What's the sustainability? If I can't see that, then I know this person is not going to be successful in getting through the fellow selection committee. I guess the next thing I would say is this is not the place to learn about the candidate's philosophy of nursing. This is the time that you're talking about contributions. I'm going to repeat myself. Contributions, evidence, dissemination, so forth and so forth. And I actually have my candidates work with a grid, and somebody's going to put that up for me now, I think. It's a very simple grid. You're not going to go, wow. It's very simple. All it says is, what are your most outstanding contributions? What is the impact of your contributions in terms of the regional, national, or international levels? And what's the evidence of each contribution? So the reason I use this is because people often start off very, very broadly. And my job is often to bring them more focused, more. I don't want them looking at 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 things. They can't be wandering. It's got to be absolutely focused. Number 4 is writing the application. And a colleague of mine said, write early, edit often. And I think that's a huge, huge thing to think about. As Anne said, it's a reflective process. It takes time to do it well. Anticipate that there's going to be a lot of revisions to the documents, that they're going to go flying back and forth between the sponsors and the applicant. And I actually suggest, which is contrary to a lot of people's thinking, I actually suggest that you begin with question 2, which actually is, what are your substantive, sustained, and outstanding impact of your contribution that is the focus for this application? Because if you really read the application, question 1 is, consider this section to be similar to an abstract of the work you will describe in section 2. Now, I personally have a hard time, although I've been told that it can be done, but I have a hard time writing an abstract of something I haven't written. So I really believe starting with question 2 is where I begin. Work with the applicant to be emphatic, but not overstating their outcomes, as somebody has already said. I believe it was Angela who said, make sure you know what your contributions in a team are. Did you lead the team? What would this team's outcomes have been if you had not been a part of that? And my other advice in this writing the application is, don't make the fellow selection committee work. Make sure that, number 1, you've got cohesion between the narratives, between the CV, and between the sponsor statement. And pay attention, as Ann said, to the word count. You don't want to go through all this work and have it just sent back to you because you're 10 words over the limit. That's the easiest thing to do. The other thing I would say, and some of you who know me do know that I'm a little odd at times. To do that, sometimes you need to have somebody who's good at abstracts. Now, I personally love to abstract. So I can take War and Peace and put it in 200 words, and I like doing it. So if you can't find the words to take out of your application, consult with somebody who can, because it's easier to do it that way than to be agonizing over it. Number 5, manage the process. I actually think, and don't attack me en masse, I actually think that if you haven't started the process right now, you're starting to be late. It does take time, and you get into the holidays, and then all of a sudden you don't have any time anymore. And my other suggestion is, make sure you have your timeline end 7 to 10 days before the application is due. There's no sense in giving yourselves agita to try and figure out if it's going to get in or not. Between the sponsors and the applicant, map out how often you're going to meet. Of course, we're doing it virtually these days, but how often are you going to meet? Because that really makes it go smoothly. Number 6, sorry, that's 6. Have a council of wise and forthright advisors and readers. What do I mean? This is an invaluable resource to both the sponsors and the applicant. I've taken on this role a number of times, and what I do, I'm not necessarily involved in writing and the process. The applicant sends me the application as it's undergoing its iterations. And I can say, as a blinded person, this doesn't make sense, or this is not connected to this, or I'm not seeing the evidence here. So I can provide them feedback. And a lot of people have found that very helpful. I do have to say, as difficult as it is for me to understand, the applicant and sponsors are not bound to accept my recommendations, but I do hope that it helps them. And I just want to take 1 minute and give you an example of a truly outstanding organization that is doing succession planning for sponsors, for fellow applicants. And that's Children's National Medical Center in DC. And I'm fortunate to be part of this group. with Kathy Chavino and Ellie Robinson. Their stated goal as a nursing organization is to identify, mentor, and support potential fellows within their staff. So we meet a couple of times a year. They are talking about who is coming up into readiness. They look at how they can best support those people and how they can develop them, who would their best sponsors be, and help and review and critique the applications as they're written. It's amazing, and it has been very powerful and very productive. So that's all I have to say. Good luck and best wishes as you make your academy journey. And Anne or Jane, who do I turn it back over to?
Yeah, I think back over to me, Kathy, and we're going to take some time now for questions and answers. I see we have in the Q&A box several questions, and that's where we're going to work off of, from the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please put your questions in there. There are no silly or stupid questions, so feel free. This is your opportunity. The first question that I see here is the criteria used by reviewers available to applicants? So Jane, as our chair, do you want to, of the Fellow Selection Committee this year, do you want to answer that?
Well, you know, the criteria we use is really on the website in the pre-appraisal checklist that's there, and the questions that are in the application. What we're doing is we're looking at that criteria to see if you're answering those questions. The further question has come up about if your contributions are only local, they aren't national or international, does that mean that you can't be accepted into the academy? We're looking for the impact of your work nationally or internationally. So if it's only in a state area, has it rolled over nationally? So that's kind of would be the answer to that.
Thank you. So another question here is, are individuals not selected made aware of the process and given directed feedback? Do you want to just take that one, Jane, while we're at it?
Sure. You know, this comes up every year, that somebody that wasn't selected, can we talk to them about their application? And actually, because of the volume and the limitations on the staff, we really can't. But what we would suggest is that the sponsor sit down with the individual and really go over maybe what were some of the weaknesses in that application. So we don't give individual feedback, but I think, like with the grid that Kathy brought up, if you honestly will look at those things and see what it is that you might have missed.
Thank you, Jane. Here's one that says, when you talk about contribution, does the applicant need to provide any evidence to prove the real contribution, or just base it on the applicant's own perspective? Angela, do you want to take that?
That's a good one. And so, yes, I mean, you're not submitting documentation of evidence, but evidence has to be there to support this. So saying that you've been included in practice guidelines, saying that your work has been used by researchers all over the world or translated in multiple languages, those kinds of things are evidence. And so no, the documentation isn't there, but it really has to be some pretty concrete levels of evidence that support your assertion that you are this expert in this area and have made this contribution in this area.
Yeah. Okay. This one, Kathy, I think I'll give this to you if you could. What if you don't know any current fellows? How do you know your work and support that are in your application? What do you do if you want to apply and don't know any fellows?
And honestly, I'm not sure. The only thing I would say is find some fellows, get to know them, let them get to know you, but do it like a year before you're going to apply, because you can't look for that depth. You could ask them to take a look at your resume, give them some examples of your work, have some interview time with them, and really get to have the opportunity to get to know that person. I do think there are parts of the country where there are fewer current fellows, and that's something that I think we have to take a look at. But also, I would say, just see if you can find somebody who can help you. And Jane, were you going to say something too?
Yeah, I was going to say one thing, if you're not familiar with current fellows, is you might look at where you went to school and see if in that university or that college, if there was somebody that's currently a fellow that might be familiar with your work, or that you could get to mentor you. But we do have states that have a more limited number of fellows there.
Yeah. Angela?
I would just also add that other professional organizations, I mean, the Academy is looking for people who are leaders, and you would not expect a leader to not belong to many negatives. You would expect a leader to belong to other nursing organizations. Within those nursing organizations are other Academy members, and that's another way to connect.
Yeah, agreed. Here's a question, maybe Roy, could you, about sponsors. For someone in academia, can both sponsors come from the applicant's university?
Sure. My response to you is the bottom line is yes, but they need to have a critical lens of what you're writing about and your contribution. The name of the sponsor, who's sponsoring you, doesn't impact, it's what's written. And, you know, they could all be from the same university and they could all write, but if they don't tell what your contribution was, show the evidence in your resume and show the contribution, you could have people from 10 different universities, but you gotta be sure you stick to those components of it. And I mentioned the critical lens, and you know, like especially a lot of informaticians will sponsor other informaticians, but they have to be able to look critically at it and say, what is that unique contribution that makes that person different than them as they sponsor them? And you know, if you do come from the same university, you know, how are you differentiating yourself in that university that would help you move forward? And I do want to add just one other thing. I don't think anybody should ever be embarrassed at going up 2 or 3 times. I mean, I know people that have, and I noticed in there was someone who wrote and said that you don't get feedback. You know, I understand you don't get a quantitative evaluation with a rubric attached to it that says, here what you did. But if you take it and then you watch or you go to an academy meeting, you can pick up what were the salient points that got somebody in versus what you didn't write about yourself. It's usually not about the candidate, it's about what they wrote.
I think that's very good advice. Kathy?
I want to emphasize that I was on the fellow selection committee for 2 terms a number of years ago, and there were heartbreaking times when you knew or you sensed that there was something underneath the application, but it wasn't explicated clearly. And that's what I think we're all trying to say. What is your contribution? What's the evidence of that contribution? How is it disseminated? What's its sustainability? Because otherwise the fellow selection committee can't move forward with your application. So I agree with you, Roy. You have to have a perspective as a sponsor, and you have to know when to say this isn't working.
And you know, I want to
go ahead.
What Angela said to the person that said she or he didn't know someone. I think that point of leadership is really key. Even if you are a researcher and your data is only about pressure ulcers, how can you lead that research into the literature and to change public policy if you don't know people? So get out and know people. It's not, you can't have a drink now, but you know, we'll get back to having a drink and chatting with people and, you know.
I also think attending the Academy meetings and,
Yes,
you know, when we
big
can
time.
gather again is another good way to network and get to know people. This
Or
next
come,
question
come to
is
the
on a
virtual
different-
meeting next week.
Right, the virtual meeting. This next question, I guess I think I'll come back to you, Jane, and I can jump into. The current process seems to be slightly ethnocentric. This seems to disadvantage applications from low and middle income countries, especially those nurses working between two languages. How is the Academy addressing the process to recognize applicants from low and middle income countries?
Well, we have quite a few international applicants, and usually those applicants are sponsored by either individuals that they've gone to school with getting their degrees, or other individuals that are working in their countries. So there's a lot of great international work that's being done, quite honestly, with great impact. So as far as I can tell, really, the international applicants have done a great job of writing excellent applications and have a very high acceptance rate.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, it is true the application must be submitted in the English language, but we have had some extraordinary applicants from all over the world doing amazing things, and have been inducted in increasing numbers. And it's really very exciting to see nurses around the globe, you know, coming and joining the Academy. Here's another, I have done so much for nursing, but my path has been non-linear. I have contributed in practice, education, service, and research. And now in my role, I'm assigned projects, but excel in all and impact thousands of nurses and patients. If I discuss all 4 areas, will I dilute my application too much? I'll take a stab at this one, and if others want to join in. I would say it depends on how you can knit it together and whether you can knit it together. You know, it's there's so many nurses who have done, just as you're saying, extraordinary things. And that's why you really need to take the time to sit down, use Kathy's grid, identify your, what you have done, and how has it either one thing building on the next, or what's the common thread and the growing sense of impact over time. It doesn't matter that you, and as a matter of fact, I think it could be a strength of an application that you've had impact in a number of areas, but you just, you know, you have a limited number of words to express it and to back it up with data and evidence of impact. So it could very well be something that would be fine to include all 4 areas. Anybody else want to comment on that? Angela?
So I know, I always think about when I came into the Academy, it was the 2 boxes with answers. And the biggest thing was saying my most significant contribution is. And you really can just answer that question with one thing, as long as that thing is significant and has impact. And I think that, so I came in as an assistant professor. A lot of people come in later. So I think we can look at this as this career trajectory, lifelong achievement award, or we can look at this from a place too of you just have to do something that makes a difference in the world. And if you make a difference in nursing and in the nursing profession, then you can make it. So I would encourage you to just think back, thinking through the thread, but also thinking about, you don't have to say a laundry list, because that does dilute. I think you clearly have to say, I've made a difference in this area, and evidence comes from my work in this, and this, but it's still one area and one thing and one. That's a cleaner, leaner application, I would think, to make than trying to put evidence across a variety of things. And I just really want to stress that to people who are newer on the curve, that you don't have to have a big career of work. It really can be a smaller thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions talks about that, the potential of your work to scale it on a larger level, whether nationally or internationally, you can see where the person's going. Kathy?
I was going to say, I appreciate what you were saying about making sure you can knit everything together and show the progression. I am concerned when I hear that kind of question that it can dilute the overall strength of the application. So try the grid, sort it out, and then, or whatever. It doesn't have to be the grid. Just try something and list out what your contributions are, and then rank order them, frankly, and kind of say, I've got 10 contributions. They're all significant, but I'm going to focus on these 3 because you don't have words enough to focus on more than a couple of contributions. It's just not possible. Even I, who can do War and Peace in 200 words, could not do that.
So I'm going to combine a couple of questions. They seem to be getting at the same thing about, are there any sample or guides that we can refer to complete an application, or is there any opportunity for pre-application coaching? Before anybody that wants to answer, I would just remind, go back to the website. There is a pre-application assessment tool that helps you get organized and helps you gauge whether you are ready for the full application. I think your sponsors that you choose should fill that role of coaching in helping you do all the things that we're talking about, getting organized, getting more explicit, backing it up with evidence, et cetera. And I don't know if others have any other quick comments here. Kathy?
I've also found that some people are very generous in being willing on a selective basis to share their application with potential applicants. And that's very helpful, I found, for people to actually see how it all plays out. You can't always find somebody who's willing to do that, but often you can, and I think it's helpful.
Should people who get turned down try again? Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah. After, I mean, I've had people send it to me saying I didn't get accepted. What do you think? And sometimes just the fresh eyes of someone else that looks at it, and then talking with your sponsors too about what might have been the pitfall. Yeah. Sponsors, I say to people when I agree to sponsor them that we're going to communicate a lot, multiple emails. It's going to feel like they're back in school with a red pen because I'm going to be scratching out everything and marking everything and pushing people to do the marketing spin.
I have seen applications come back, and it's like what Jane said earlier. You read an application one year and you think, wow, either these sponsors didn't really amplify, like they're missing something, or there's something incomplete. You have the sense that there's a lot there. But as I said, all the committee has is what those materials contain. We can't go outside of there. But then I've seen the next year and something, either people have gotten a different sponsor, changed sponsors, or they have spent more time clarifying, backing up their narrative with data and evidence of their impact. And it's, as I said, the application sings, it's clear. You spend almost, you don't need to even think twice about it. They're clearly a qualified candidate.
And one of the things that I would just like to say on the reapplication is the one thing I've noticed when people have applied and then they'll call me and say, well, will you sponsor me? I didn't get in the first time. I'm like, no, go back to your sponsors. You didn't spend enough time on that application the first time. Now you're getting your act together to get it better. And what you should have done the first time and paid attention to what Kathy said. And if you're just starting now, you're really on a steep learning curve to get it in. So, start now for 2022 and you'll be in great shape, because it takes a couple of phone calls to make sure it's concise and succinct. But do apply, please.
Kathy?
So this is an extreme example, but I had a colleague who I knew had applied 3 times and had not been accepted any of the 3 times, and yet, and I wasn't her sponsor, his sponsor. There was something in me that said, we need to know more. So I actually took it upon me to go and interview this person. And this person was much more able to articulate what she had done verbally than what she was able to do in writing. I want to repeat, I did not write it for her. What I did was reflect back to her that this is what I heard. And somehow it clicked differently. And I wouldn't do that all the time, but I was pretty convinced that this person should be in the academy.
Here's one. We might have different views on this. Do you recommend that we draft a letter of support for the sponsor? This is from an applicant.
No.
And there's a red flag right there. What do you say, Kathy?
No. The sponsor needs to know your work. The sponsor needs to be able to articulate the support around the specific contributions, which is why it's important that the sponsor gets to know you. If you don't know fellows, that you've spent time with the person, but no.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Jane?
And unfortunately, I believe that sometimes happens, because on the selection committee, we will see letters from the sponsors that are almost identical,
Right.
and they really just reflect what's in the application, where the sponsor letters that are well written, they really amplify the application, and they give us information or highlight information that's not really written in the application from the applicant's viewpoint, but it ties in what's in the CV, and it really reinforces that evidence. So the well-written sponsor letters are really, really important.
Yeah. I do think, though, that as an applicant, as you choose your sponsors, that first meeting should be about,
Yes.
Kathy, can you write about my contributions here? Because Jane, I would like you to write about the impact here. And, that does speak to somebody who talked about, having 2 areas of research. Is that okay? Yes, that's fine. That's great. And you can ask a sponsor from each area to really talk about that work that you do and what the impact is.
That's why I believe it's so important at the very beginning that the 2 sponsors and the applicants sit down and talk about who's going to do what and who's going to focus on what.
Yeah. I would note that for people still on the call, the chat has a lot of people chiming in with their own advice and experience, and there's some good stuff in there. So take a look at that. I'm aware of time, so I'm trying to just get through a few other questions here. Can Angela repeat the 3 main points she discussed? It was hard to hear.
Well, I said that I was going to discuss your contribution, and that was the emphasis on impact and making sure that it was a significant problem and that you had impact from the problem, and that the scope of the work was really at a national level, international level, in some cases regional, state, but that would have to be something really significant, and a sustained contribution and leadership. And then I discussed sources of evidence, like things like the publications and the cited work, translated work, replications, adoption of findings and practice guidelines, National Academy of Medicine books, education or policy use legislation that came about because of your work, review panels, study sections, other recognition of expertise through organizations or international work, board participation, leadership in professional organizations. And then I think by the time I got to the pitfalls, I was off mic, so you have that. Those were the other 2.
Okay, I think we are just about out of time. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jane. I'm sorry we did not answer all the questions, and perhaps that can be done at the next session.
Well, thank you, Anne, Roy, Angela, Kathy. and the Academy for putting this together. I should have said in the beginning that there have been over 400 of you that have participated or were enrolled in this webinar. For the dates for next year, January 19th is when the application will be open. And as it says, the deadline will be February the 19th. So it'll be shortly after that that the selection committee members, the dyads and the co-chairs will receive our applications to start reviewing. And then we will have our discussion of those applications that we need to towards the end of April. That's when the 2.5-day meeting or Zoom like this year will occur. Fortunately, all this information, this webinar will be on the Academy website. So you'll be able to refer back to it. And also probably in early December, we'll do another session highlighting the application process again. So that's my final words, unless anybody else on the panel has anything to say. I just want to thank everybody for those of you that signed up to be with us, and we look forward to all those applications that will come in. And thanks again to the Academy for this opportunity.